Imagine walking through corridors so silent that your own heartbeat sounds like thunder. Picture walls of granite 30 feet high, designed not just to contain bodies, but to crush the human spirit with surgical precision. The year is 1829, and in the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, America is about to conduct its most terrifying experiment, one that will cost nearly $4 million in today's money and destroy hundreds of human minds in the process. This is Eastern State Penitentiary, where for the first time in human history, complete isolation becomes the primary method of criminal punishment. No conversation, no human contact, no sound except the whisper of your own voice slowly going insane in a cell 8 feet wide by 12 feet long. Charles Williams enters cell number 1 on October 25, 1829, a common burglar sentenced to 2 years of absolute silence. What emerges 2 years later isn't a reformed criminal. It's a man who believes he's an angel, who speaks to invisible companions, who has been so thoroughly broken by isolation that he can no longer function in human society. The architects called it enlightened penology. International observers hailed it as revolutionary. But the prisoners who lived through it? They called it something else entirely: systematic torture disguised as humanitarian reform. Today, we're opening the classified files on America's most notorious experiment in breaking the human mind. We're going deep into the stone corridors, where screams were never allowed to be heard, where men scratched their final thoughts into granite walls, where isolation became a weapon more devastating than any guillotine. Join us as we uncover the true cost of Eastern State Penitentiary, where America learned that destroying a human being doesn't require violence, just perfect, calculated silence. The year is 1829, and in the rolling hills of eastern Pennsylvania, something monstrous is being born. Not a creature of flesh and blood, but something far more insidious. A machine designed to break the human spirit with surgical precision. The first shovel breaks ground on October 15th, cutting through soil that has known only the gentle footsteps of farmers and the roots of ancient oak trees. But this earth is destined for something darker. The men wielding those shovels don't yet understand they are architects of America's most notorious experiment in isolation and despair. Cherry Hill. The name sounds almost pastoral, doesn't it? Like a place where children might pick fruit on summer afternoons, where church bells ring across meadows dotted with wildflowers. Instead, it will become synonymous with madness, with the slow dissolution of the human mind under the weight of absolute solitude. The Pennsylvania legislature has allocated $150,000 for this project, nearly $4 million in today's currency. Every brick, every iron bar, every stone block represents a deliberate choice to pursue what they call reformation through reflection. What they're actually building is a cathedral of silence, a temple to the belief that complete isolation can somehow purify a corrupted soul. Architect John Haviland spreads his blueprints across a makeshift table, his fingers tracing lines that will soon become walls capable of containing screams no one will ever hear. The design is revolutionary in its cruelty. 7 cell blocks radiating from a central hub like the spokes of a wheel, each one a corridor of individual cells, where men will live, eat, work, and slowly lose their minds in perfect isolation. The Gothic Revival style isn't chosen for its beauty. Every pointed arch, every fortress-like battlement, every shadow cast by the imposing facade serves a psychological purpose. This building is meant to inspire fear before you even cross its threshold. The very stones seem to whisper of judgment and eternal punishment. As autumn turns to winter, the foundation takes shape. Granite blocks, each weighing more than a grown man, are lowered into place by teams of horses and pulleys. The sound of hammers against stone echoes across the countryside from dawn until dusk, a rhythmic pounding that locals begin to associate with something ominous growing in their midst. The walls rise slowly, deliberately. These aren't ordinary prison walls. They're designed to contain not just bodies, but sounds, thoughts, hope itself. Each cell will be exactly 8 feet wide by 12 feet long by 10 feet high, 960 cubic feet of space in which a human being will spend years, perhaps decades, speaking to no one, hearing no voice but their own. But it's the silence between the hammer blows that holds the real terror. In those moments of quiet, you can almost hear the future, the whispered prayers of men going insane, the scratching of fingernails against stone, the wet sound of tears falling onto rough wooden floors. The project moves forward with the inexorable momentum of absolute conviction. Dr. Benjamin Rush, the father of American psychiatry, has provided the theoretical foundation. Isolation, he argues, will force criminals to confront their sins without the corrupting influence of other prisoners. In the perfect silence of solitary confinement, the criminal mind will turn inward, examine its failures, and emerge reborn. It's a beautiful theory. It's also completely, catastrophically wrong. By spring of 1830, the basic structure stands like a medieval fortress transplanted to the New World. The outer wall stretches 30 feet high, topped with guard towers that seem to scrape the Pennsylvania sky. But it's what lies within these walls that truly defies comprehension, a machine for the systematic destruction of human connection, disguised as enlightened penology. Each cell is a masterpiece of controlled deprivation. A single window, positioned high near the ceiling, allows just enough light to read the Bible, the only book permitted in this place. A small exercise yard barely 10 feet square, attached to each cell, provides exactly 1 hour of solitary outdoor time per day. No conversation, no shared glances, no human contact of any kind. The heating system represents Victorian engineering at its most efficient and terrifying. Hot air flows through underground ducts, warming the cells to exactly the temperature needed to sustain life without providing comfort. Too hot, and the prisoners might find respite from their psychological torment. Too cold, and they might die before their sentences are complete. The temperature is calibrated for maximum psychological impact, warm enough to survive, cold enough to suffer. As the summer of 1830 burns across Pennsylvania, workmen install the final elements of this elaborate torture device. The doors are solid oak, reinforced with iron bands, fitted with slots barely wide enough to pass a tin plate of food. The locks are works of art in their complexity, each one unique, each one designed to open only for authorized personnel carrying the proper keys. But it's the silence that will prove to be the most sophisticated element of this entire system. The cells are positioned so that no prisoner can see another. The corridors are designed so that voices cannot carry from cell to cell. Guards wear soft-soled shoes to eliminate even the comfort of familiar footsteps. This isn't just isolation. It's the complete elimination of human society, the surgical removal of everything that makes us social creatures. The cost continues to mount as construction nears completion. By October 1830, the total expenditure has reached $230,000, nearly $6 million in today's currency. Every penny has been spent in service of a single terrifying idea, that human beings can be reformed through absolute loneliness. The irony is inescapable. The men building this monument to isolation work together, sharing jokes and meals, helping each other lift heavy stones and position iron bars. They go home each evening to families, to conversation, to the simple human pleasures of shared experience. Yet they're creating a place where other human beings will be systematically denied these most basic needs. The first warden, Samuel Wood, arrives in September to inspect his domain. He walks through the empty corridors, his footsteps echoing off stone walls that have never heard a human voice. The sound follows him like a ghost, bouncing from cell to cell, growing fainter with each repetition until it dies in the absolute silence that will soon define this place. Wood understands his role with crystalline clarity. He's not running a prison, he's operating a laboratory. Each prisoner will be a test subject in humanity's first systematic experiment with solitary confinement as the primary method of incarceration. The hypothesis is elegant in its simplicity. Remove all human contact, and the criminal mind will cure itself. The warden's quarters sit at the heart of the complex, a comfortable apartment surrounded by this wheel of misery. From his living room window, Wood can see down every corridor, observe every cell door, monitor his kingdom of silence without ever having to hear the sounds that isolation produces. The weeping, the muttering, the occasional scream of a mind finally snapping under the weight of absolute loneliness. October 25, 1829, exactly 1 year after ground was broken, the doors of Eastern State Penitentiary swing open to receive their first occupant. The date is recorded in the warden's logbook with bureaucratic precision, as if this moment is no different from the opening of a new post office or railway station. But this is different. This is the moment when America begins its first systematic experiment in breaking the human spirit through scientific application of solitude. The theories have been debated, the architecture has been perfected, the procedures have been established. Now comes the test. Can absolute isolation truly reform the criminal mind, or will it simply drive men insane with mechanical efficiency? The answer is already written in the stone walls, carved into the iron bars, whispered by the wind that moves through those narrow exercise yards. This place will indeed change every man who enters it. But reformation and destruction, it turns out, can look remarkably similar from the outside. As the heavy gates close behind that first prisoner, the sound reverberates through the corridors like a death knell. Not for the man now locked away, but for an entire philosophical approach to human nature. Eastern State Penitentiary is about to prove that some experiments should never be conducted, that some questions about the human condition are too dangerous to answer. The machine is complete. The experiment begins. And in the silence that follows, something fundamental about American justice dies, replaced by a more efficient method of human destruction than the gallows ever provided. The stones remember everything. The iron bars hold more than bodies. They contain the screams that were never allowed to be heard, the pleas that were never permitted to be spoken, the prayers that echoed only in minds slowly unraveling in the perfect isolation of enlightened penology. The first prisoner to enter Eastern State Penitentiary is Charles Williams, convicted of burglary, sentenced to 2 years of absolute silence. The date is October 25, 1829. And as Williams crosses the threshold, he becomes patient zero in America's experiment with systematic psychological torture. The intake process has been designed with theatrical precision. Williams is blindfolded before entering the main building, led through corridors he cannot see, guided by guards who speak only in whispers. The blindfold ensures he learns nothing about the layout, gains no familiarity with his surroundings, acquires no mental map that might provide comfort in the darkness to come. Cell number 1 is 8 feet wide, 12 feet long, 10 feet high. The mathematical precision of these dimensions isn't accidental. This space has been calculated to provide exactly enough room for a human being to exist without offering any possibility of comfort or distraction. Williams can take 4 steps in any direction before meeting a wall. 4 steps to madness, measured and remeasured by architects who believed they were designing redemption. The door closes with a sound like thunder trapped in stone. The key turns with mechanical finality, and Charles Williams finds himself in a silence so complete it seems to have physical weight, pressing against his eardrums, filling his lungs, seeping into his bones like winter cold. The Bible sits on a small shelf built into the wall, the only book, the only entertainment, the only companion Williams will have for the next 24 months. 730 days of reading the same words over and over until the verses blur together into meaningless syllables, until the promise of salvation begins to sound like mockery. His meals arrive through a slot in the door. Breakfast at 7, dinner at 5, with mechanical regularity that becomes its own form of torture. The tin plates are withdrawn unwashed, preventing even the small ritual of cleaning that might provide structure to the endless hours. Time becomes fluid in the absence of human contact, stretching like heated metal until minutes feel like hours and hours feel like years. The exercise yard attached to cell number 1 is exactly 10 feet by 20 feet. 200 square feet of outdoor space where Williams will spend 1 hour each day walking in circles, talking to no one, seeing no one except the guards who watch him from towers designed to prevent even eye contact. The walls of this tiny courtyard rise 18 feet on all sides, allowing him to see only a narrow strip of sky, a reminder of the world he has lost. Within the first week, Williams begins to understand the true nature of his punishment. This isn't incarceration, it's erasure. Every aspect of his human identity that depends on interaction with others is being systematically stripped away. His voice, unused for days at a time, begins to sound strange to his own ears when he whispers prayers in the darkness. His name, unspoken by any other human being, starts to feel like a word from a foreign language. By the end of his first month, Williams has developed habits that the guards document with clinical interest. He talks to his meals, greeting the tin plate like an old friend when it arrives through the slot. He names the stones in his cell wall, creating an elaborate mythology around their shapes and textures. He holds conversations with biblical characters, speaking both parts of dialogues with Moses, with Christ, with the Apostle Paul. The warden, Samuel Wood, observes these behaviors through a peephole designed into each cell door. He records Williams' deterioration in meticulous detail, noting the progression from rational solitude to active delusion. Day 67. Subject speaks frequently to unseen companions. Day 93. Subject appears to be conducting religious services for imaginary congregation. Day 112. Subject found kneeling before cell wall, apparently confessing sins to stone. This is the data, Dr. Benjamin Rush wanted, empirical evidence of how isolation affects the criminal mind. But the evidence tells a story Rush never intended to write. Williams isn't being reformed, he's being systematically destroyed, one day of silence at a time. The second prisoner arrives 3 weeks later. Joseph Clark, convicted of theft, sentence of 18 months. Cell number 2 receives its occupant with the same ritual blindfolding, the same theatrical procession through corridors Clark will never see. The machine of isolation adds another component, another test subject, another human being to be ground down by the millstone of absolute solitude. Clark's deterioration follows a different pattern than Williams. Where Williams retreated into religious fantasy, Clark becomes obsessed with counting. He counts his steps around the exercise yard, 47 steps to complete one circuit. He counts his heartbeats during the long nights, losing track somewhere in the thousands. He counts the stones in his cell wall again and again, always arriving at different totals, becoming increasingly agitated by his inability to achieve consistent results. By Christmas of 1829, Eastern State holds 12 prisoners in 12 separate cells, each man living in perfect isolation, each mind following its own unique path toward breakdown. The guards move through the corridors like ghosts, their soft-soled shoes making no sound on the stone floors. The silence has become so complete that a dropped pin would sound like breaking glass. Warden Wood maintains detailed records of each prisoner's condition, documenting symptoms with the precision of a medical researcher. Prisoner 3 has begun scratching marks on his cell wall with his fingernails, creating elaborate geometric patterns that cover every available inch of stone. Prisoner 7 rocks back and forth for hours at a time, humming the same melody until his voice cracks and fails. Prisoner 9 has stopped eating regularly, claiming the food tastes like ash in his mouth. The theoretical foundation for this experiment remains solid in the minds of its architects. The Pennsylvania system, as it comes to be known, is being studied by prison reformers across the world. Delegations arrive from England, from France, from Prussia, eager to observe this revolutionary approach to criminal rehabilitation. They tour the empty corridors, examine the perfectly designed cells, and return home with glowing reports about American innovation in penology. But they never speak to the prisoners. The isolation that defines the Pennsylvania system extends even to these official visitors. They see the machinery of solitude without witnessing its effects, observe the architecture of silence without hearing the sounds it produces in the human mind. The first death occurs on February 14, 1830. Prisoner 8, a young man named Thomas Henderson, convicted of forgery, is found hanging in his cell, his shirt torn into strips and braided into rope. The official cause of death is recorded as suicide, but the guards who cut him down whisper about something else, about the look in Henderson's eyes during his final weeks, the way he seemed to be watching things that weren't there, listening to voices that couldn't be heard. Henderson's cell is cleaned, disinfected, and prepared for the next occupant within 24 hours. The machinery of isolation cannot pause for individual tragedy. Cell number 8 receives a new prisoner 3 days later, William Morrison, convicted of assault, sentenced to 3 years of perfect silence. The suicide troubles Warden Wood, but it doesn't shake his faith in the system. Henderson was weak, he records in his private journal. The solitary system reveals the true character of its subjects. Those with moral strength will emerge reformed, while those lacking inner fortitude will falter. It's a process of natural selection applied to the criminal mind, survival of the spiritually fittest. This rationalization allows Wood to sleep comfortably in his apartment at the center of the complex, surrounded by the very silence he's imposing on his charges. He reads by lamplight while 24 men sit in darkness just yards away. He enjoys conversation with visiting dignitaries while those same men haven't heard their own names spoken aloud in months. Spring arrives in 1830, and with it comes the full flowering of the Pennsylvania system's true nature. The isolation that seemed merely strict during winter's short days becomes genuinely torturous as the hours of daylight stretch longer. The narrow windows in each cell, positioned to provide just enough light for reading, become reminders of a world that continues to exist beyond these walls, a world of conversation, of laughter, of simple human connection. Prisoner 12. A man named Robert Chen, convicted of counterfeiting, begins to believe he's already dead, that his cell is actually a tomb, and the guards are angels conducting him through some elaborate afterlife. He stops responding to commands, refuses to exercise, and spends hours staring at the small window as if waiting for divine revelation. The guards report these symptoms to Warden Wood with increasing frequency, but their concerns are dismissed as evidence that the system is working. The prisoners' minds are being purified through suffering, their criminal impulses burned away by the fire of solitary reflection. The fact that this purification resembles madness is simply proof of how corrupted these men were before their imprisonment. By summer's end, the pattern has become undeniable to everyone, except those committed to seeing success. Nearly every prisoner exhibits signs of psychological deterioration, talking to imaginary companions, developing elaborate delusions, engaging in repetitive behaviors that serve no rational purpose. Some rock back and forth for hours. Others pace their cells in precise patterns, wearing grooves in the stone floor with their endless circuits. The most disturbing cases involve prisoners who seem to disappear inside themselves, becoming so withdrawn from external reality that they no longer respond to their own names. They eat when food is placed before them, exercise when ordered to do so, but their eyes hold no recognition of the world around them. They've become living ghosts, present in body but absent in every way that matters. Yet the experiment continues, driven by institutional momentum and ideological commitment. The Pennsylvania legislature has invested too much money, too much prestige, and too much faith in this revolutionary approach to admit failure. The reports sent to international observers continue to emphasize the theoretical benefits of solitary confinement while carefully omitting details about its practical effects. Charles Williams, the first prisoner to enter Eastern State, is scheduled for release in October 1831. 2 full years of absolute isolation. His case will serve as the ultimate test of the Pennsylvania system's effectiveness. If isolation can truly reform a criminal mind, Williams should emerge from cell number 1 as a changed man, rehabilitated through reflection, cured of his criminal impulses by the medicine of solitude. The truth is already visible to anyone willing to see it. Williams has been talking to his cell walls for months, conducting elaborate conversations with imaginary friends who live in the patterns of the stone. He's created an entire fantasy world populated by characters only he can see, and he interacts with this imaginary society more naturally than he responds to the actual guards who bring his food. But Warden Wood continues to believe in the righteousness of his mission. Each broken mind represents not failure, but progress, evidence that the criminal spirit is being driven out, that space is being created for moral reformation. The screams that echo through the corridors at night, muffled by thick walls but never entirely silenced, are the birth pangs of new souls being born. The machine grinds on, adding new prisoners each month, filling cells with fresh subjects for this grand experiment in human isolation. And somewhere in the perfect silence of those stone corridors, something fundamental about justice and mercy dies a little more each day, replaced by the mechanical efficiency of systematic psychological destruction. 14. 32. The winter of 1830 descends on Eastern State Penitentiary like a living thing, seeping through the stone walls and settling into the bones of the 216 men now locked in perfect isolation. The heating system, so carefully calibrated to maintain life without providing comfort, becomes an instrument of exquisite torture as temperatures hover just above freezing, cold enough to ensure constant misery, but warm enough to prevent merciful death. Prisoner 47, a man named Marcus Webb, convicted of horse theft, begins his descent into madness with mathematical precision. The isolation has been eating at his mind for 8 months now, and the cold provides the final catalyst for complete psychological collapse. Webb becomes convinced that he's shrinking, that each day he grows smaller until eventually he'll become too tiny to be seen by the guards. He measures himself obsessively against the walls of his cell, marking his height with scratches that grow lower and lower as his delusion deepens. The guards document Webb's condition with clinical detachment. Day 237. Subject believes he has decreased in stature by 6 inches. Day 251. Subject claims to be 3 feet tall, requests smaller clothing. Day 262. Subject found cowering in corner of cell, claiming guards cannot see him due to diminished size. But Webb's madness is just one note in a symphony of deterioration that fills every corridor of Eastern State. In cell 33, a counterfeiter named James Morrison has convinced himself that he's actually a famous architect, and he spends his days designing elaborate buildings on the walls of his cell using pieces of charcoal salvaged from his heating grate. His blueprints cover every available surface, detailed drawings of impossible structures that exist only in his fractured mind. The complexity of Morrison's delusions astounds even the guards who observe him through their peepholes. He's created an entire fictional career, complete with imaginary clients who visit his cell for consultations. He holds these meetings with the utmost seriousness, discussing construction materials and design specifications with empty air, his voice taking on different tones and accents as he plays both architect and customer in elaborate theatrical productions performed for an audience of stone walls. Cell 61 houses William Foster, a former bank clerk convicted of embezzlement, who has developed the most sophisticated response to isolation yet documented. Foster has created an entire imaginary family, a wife, 3 children, and 2 grandparents, and he conducts his daily life as if they share his 8 by 12-foot cell. He sets places at his meal table for all 6 family members, carefully dividing his meager rations among imaginary plates. He holds conversations about household finances, discusses his children's education, and argues with his fictional father-in-law about politics. The guards find Foster's delusion particularly disturbing because of its completeness. He never breaks character, never acknowledges that his family exists only in his mind. When guards enter his cell for inspections, Foster introduces them to his wife and children, growing genuinely confused and agitated when the guards fail to acknowledge these invisible companions. The isolation has become so total that Foster has recreated human society inside his own skull, populating his mental world with the relationships that solitary confinement has destroyed. Dr. Francis Lieber arrives in January 1831 as an official observer from the Prussian government, tasked with evaluating the Pennsylvania system for potential implementation in German prisons. Lieber is a scholar, a humanitarian, a man who believes deeply in the possibility of human redemption through scientific methods. He expects to find evidence of criminal reformation, proof that isolation can cure the diseased mind. What Lieber discovers instead forces him to confront the gap between theory and practice that defines Eastern State Penitentiary. His first tour of the facility, conducted by Warden Wood with obvious pride, reveals architecture of breathtaking ambition. The radial design, the individual exercise yards, the sophisticated heating system, every element represents the pinnacle of enlightened penology. But Lieber is a careful observer, and he notices details that Wood either ignores or dismisses. The silence, first of all, isn't natural. It's the artificial quiet of systematic suppression, maintained through constant vigilance and the threat of punishment. The guards move like specters, communicating through gestures, their soft-soled shoes eliminating even the comfort of familiar footsteps. This isn't peaceful solitude, it's enforced sensory deprivation on a massive scale. Lieber requests permission to interview individual prisoners, and Wood reluctantly agrees, confident that the reformed criminals will testify to the system's effectiveness. The first interview takes place in Cell 29, home to a burglar named Patrick O'Malley, who's been isolated for 14 months. O'Malley greets Lieber with desperate enthusiasm, speaking rapidly and incoherently about the visitors who've been coming to his cell. Famous politicians, beautiful women, childhood friends, all of whom exist only in his imagination. He describes elaborate conversations with these hallucinations, complex relationships that have developed over months of solitary dialogue. When Lieber gently suggests that these visitors might not be real, O'Malley becomes agitated, insisting that Dr. Lieber must be blind not to see the crowd of people currently standing in his cell. The interview lasts 20 minutes. O'Malley speaks continuously, desperately, as if the opportunity for human conversation is water to a man dying of thirst. He pleads with Lieber not to leave, offers to share his cell, promises to be quiet if only the doctor will stay and provide company. When Lieber finally departs, O'Malley's screams follow him down the corridor, muffled by thick walls but audible enough to chill the blood. The second interview proves even more disturbing. Prisoner 55, a forger named David Chen, has been isolated for 10 months. Chen greets Lieber politely but seems unable to maintain focus on the conversation. His attention wanders constantly, as if he's listening to sounds that Lieber cannot hear. Chen asks questions and then provides his own answers in different voices, conducting multiple sides of a dialogue that makes perfect sense to him but sounds like incoherent babbling to his visitor. When Lieber asks about Chen's treatment, the prisoner responds with confusion. Treatment for what? He's not sick, he explains. He's simply living with his roommates, gesturing to empty corners of his cell where he sees companions who don't exist. The isolation has become so complete that Chen has lost the ability to distinguish between internal and external reality. His mind has created a social world to replace the one that solitary confinement destroyed. After a week of such interviews, Dr. Lieber requests a private meeting with Warden Wood. The conversation takes place in Wood's comfortable apartment, surrounded by books and furniture and all the amenities of civilized life. Wood serves tea and speaks enthusiastically about the theoretical foundations of the Pennsylvania system, but Lieber cuts through the academic discussion with brutal directness. "You're not reforming these men," Lieber tells Wood. "You're driving them insane with systematic precision." Wood's response reveals the depth of his self-deception. The symptoms Lieber describes aren't evidence of madness, he insists, but proof that the system is working. The prisoners are shedding their criminal identities, experiencing the psychological breakdown necessary for spiritual rebirth. The hallucinations, the delusions, the complete disconnection from reality, these are labor pains of moral transformation. And when this transformation is complete, Lieber asks, when these men have lost all connection to consensual reality, how will they function in the world you're preparing to release them into? Wood has no answer because he's never seriously considered the question. The Pennsylvania system is designed to change criminals, not to prepare them for release. The machine of isolation operates according to its own internal logic, measuring success by the degree of psychological destruction it achieves rather than by any practical standard of rehabilitation. Lieber spends his final week at Eastern State documenting specific cases of mental deterioration. Prisoner 73 believes he's made of glass and will shatter if touched. Prisoner 91 has convinced himself that he died years ago and is experiencing an elaborate form of purgatory. Prisoner 104 speaks only in biblical verses, having lost the ability to communicate in ordinary language. The patterns are consistent across the entire population. Long-term isolation produces hallucinations, delusions, and complete breaks from reality. The men who enter Eastern State as criminals emerge as madmen, if they emerge at all. The suicide rate, carefully concealed from public view, has reached nearly 15%. Those who survive intact are so rare as to be statistical anomalies. Charles Williams, the first prisoner to enter Eastern State, is scheduled for release in October 1831. His case has become a symbol of the Pennsylvania system's promise. If isolation can reform him, it can reform anyone. Wardenwood speaks about Williams with particular pride, describing him as a success story that will vindicate the entire experiment. But Dr. Lieber's private interview with Williams reveals a different truth. The man who will soon be released into society believes he's an angel sent to earth to judge the living and the dead. He speaks in riddles, interprets ordinary events as divine signs, and shows no recognition of his crime or understanding of why he was imprisoned. 2 years of perfect isolation have transformed him from a common burglar into something approaching a religious fanatic, convinced of his own supernatural nature and utterly disconnected from human society. This man cannot function in the world, Lieber writes in his final report. He has lost not only his criminal tendencies, but his fundamental humanity. The Pennsylvania system has succeeded in destroying everything that made him a person, both good and evil. The report Lieber submits to the Prussian government is devastating in its clarity. The Pennsylvania system, he concludes, is not a method of criminal reformation, but a sophisticated form of torture that destroys the human mind while maintaining the fiction of humanitarian treatment. The isolation doesn't cure criminal behavior. It simply replaces it with madness. But Lieber's report disappears into bureaucratic channels, filed away and forgotten. The Pennsylvania system has acquired too much momentum, too much international reputation, and too much institutional investment to be abandoned based on inconvenient evidence. The machine of isolation continues to operate, adding new prisoners each month, grinding human minds into powder with the efficiency of industrial machinery. By the spring of 1831, Eastern State Penitentiary houses 312 men in perfect solitude. Each one exists in his own private universe, cut off from human contact, sustained by delusions that grow more elaborate with each passing day. They are living proof that isolation doesn't reform the criminal mind. It simply provides a cleaner, quieter method of human destruction than the gallows ever offered. The experiment continues, driven by faith rather than evidence, sustained by theory rather than results. And in the perfect silence of those stone corridors, America's commitment to systematic torture masquerades as the triumph of enlightened penology. The release of Charles Williams on October 25, 1831, marks exactly 2 years since the first prisoner entered Eastern State Penitentiary. The date is recorded with ceremonial precision in Wardenwood's ledger, noted as a milestone in the great experiment of solitary reformation. Williams emerges from cell number 1 carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and a mind that has been systematically dismantled by 24 months of perfect isolation. The man who shuffles through the prison gates bears little resemblance to the burglar who entered 2 years earlier. Williams moves with the hesitant gait of someone navigating an unfamiliar world, his eyes darting constantly as if searching for threats that exist only in his fractured perception. He speaks in whispers to invisible companions, conducting conversations with the angels he believes have been his cellmates for the past year. Philadelphia in 1831 is a bustling city of 160,000 souls, a cacophony of voices and movement that strikes Williams like a physical blow. The simple sound of human conversation, vendors calling their wares, children playing in the streets, couples discussing their daily concerns, overwhelms his nervous system, which has adapted to 2 years of absolute silence. He covers his ears and retreats to doorways, seeking the isolation that has become his only familiar environment. Within 48 hours of his release, Williams is arrested for wandering the streets in obvious distress, talking to people who aren't there, claiming to be an angel on a divine mission to save Philadelphia from moral corruption. The police, unaware of his recent imprisonment, assume he's simply another madman in a city that's beginning to collect them in alarming numbers. Williams spends 3 days in the Philadelphia House of Detention before officials realize his connection to Eastern State. The irony is perfect and terrible. A man released from prison as reformed must immediately be confined again as insane. Warden Wood, when informed of Williams's situation, expresses disappointment that the prisoner has failed to maintain the spiritual discipline learned during his isolation. The fault, Wood concludes, lies not with the Pennsylvania system, but with Williams' weak character. But Williams is only the first. As more prisoners complete their sentences and return to society, a pattern emerges that cannot be ignored even by the most devoted advocates of solitary confinement. These men, supposedly reformed by isolation, prove incapable of functioning in human society. They've been so thoroughly disconnected from social reality that ordinary interactions become impossible. Joseph Clark, the second prisoner to enter Eastern State, is released in April 1832 after completing his 18-month sentence for theft. Clark has spent his isolation years developing an obsession with numerical patterns, finding mystical significance in the arrangement of stones in his cell wall, the frequency of his heartbeat, the number of steps required to cross his exercise yard. Release into the chaotic mathematics of urban life sends him into complete psychological collapse. Clark wanders Philadelphia's streets counting everything he sees: windows in buildings, cobblestones in streets, people passing on sidewalks. He becomes agitated when interrupted in these calculations, insisting that maintaining accurate counts is essential to preventing some unspecified catastrophe. Within a week, he's arrested for disturbing the peace after attacking a shopkeeper who prevented him from counting the goods displayed in a store window. The Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane begins to receive a steady stream of former Eastern State prisoners, men whose minds have been so damaged by isolation that they can no longer distinguish between internal fantasy and external reality. Dr. Thomas Kirkbride, the hospital's superintendent, documents their symptoms with growing alarm. These patients share characteristics unlike any other form of mental illness he's encountered. They speak to invisible companions with more comfort than they show toward actual human beings. They interpret ordinary social interactions as threats or divine communications. They've lost the ability to engage in normal conversation, either remaining silent for hours or speaking in elaborate monologues that follow no rational structure. Most disturbing of all, they seem to prefer solitude to company, retreating into corners and creating imaginary social worlds rather than engaging with the real people around them. Dr. Kirkbride requests a meeting with Warden Wood to discuss this alarming trend. The conversation takes place in Wood's office, surrounded by the architectural plans and theoretical treatises that justify the Pennsylvania system. Kirkbride presents his findings with clinical precision: detailed case studies of former Eastern State prisoners, documentation of their symptoms, evidence that solitary confinement produces a specific form of mental illness previously unknown to medical science. These men haven't been reformed, Kirkbride explains. They've been systematically deprived of everything that makes them human. You've created a new form of madness, one that specifically targets the social instincts that allow people to function in civilized society. Wood's response reveals the intellectual rigidity that makes true reform impossible. The former prisoners' inability to function in society, he argues, simply proves how corrupted they were before their imprisonment. The Pennsylvania system has succeeded in burning away their criminal tendencies. If they cannot adapt to lawful society, that reflects their fundamental moral weakness, not any flaw in the system of solitary confinement. And what of those who never emerge from your cells? Kirkbride asks. What of the suicides, the men who die of despair, the prisoners who simply stop eating and waste away? Are these also evidence of moral weakness? The suicide rate at Eastern State has reached nearly 20% by 1832, a statistic carefully omitted from official reports but impossible to hide from medical observers. Men kill themselves with bed sheets twisted into nooses, with pieces of metal torn from their cell fixtures, with their own fingernails when no other means present themselves. Some simply stop eating, choosing slow starvation over continued isolation. Wood dismisses these deaths as the inevitable consequence of housing morally defective individuals. The strong survive solitary confinement and emerge reformed, while the weak eliminate themselves, a form of natural selection that benefits society by removing its most corrupted elements. He speaks of dead prisoners with the same clinical detachment he applies to broken machinery, viewing their suicides as mechanical failures rather than human tragedies. The international reputation of the Pennsylvania system continues to grow even as evidence of its failures accumulates. Delegations arrive regularly from European governments, eager to observe this revolutionary approach to criminal justice. They tour the facilities, examine the architecture, and return home with glowing reports about American innovation in penology. But they see only the machinery of isolation, never its human cost. Alexis de Tocqueville and Gustave de Beaumont arrived from France in May 1831, commissioned by their government to study American prison systems. Their visit to Eastern State lasts 3 weeks, during which they conduct extensive interviews with both administrators and selected prisoners. Their initial enthusiasm for the Pennsylvania system gradually transforms into horror as they witness its effects firsthand. The French visitors are particularly struck by the case of prisoner 127, a young man named Timothy Walsh, convicted of burglary. Walsh has been isolated for 8 months, and his deterioration exemplifies everything wrong with solitary confinement as a method of reform. He greets Tocqueville and Beaumont with desperate gratitude, speaking rapidly and incoherently about his isolation-induced hallucinations. Walsh describes elaborate conversations with his dead mother, who visits his cell nightly to discuss his moral development. He's convinced that his isolation is a form of divine testing, that angels monitor his progress toward redemption through hidden peepholes in his cell walls. When the French visitors gently suggest that these experiences might be products of his imagination, Walsh becomes agitated, insisting that his spiritual visitors are more real than the flesh-and-blood men questioning him. "This is not reformation," Beaumont writes in his private journal. "This is the systematic destruction of human reason, disguised as moral improvement." The French report published in 1833 as On the Penitentiary System in the United States and Its Application in France provides the first comprehensive critique of the Pennsylvania system by respected international observers. Tocqueville and Beaumont document the high suicide rate, the prevalence of mental illness among prisoners, and the complete inability of released inmates to function in society. Their conclusion is devastating. This absolute solitude, if nothing interrupts it, is beyond the strength of man. It destroys the criminal without intermission and without pity. It does not reform, it kills. But the French critique arrives too late to prevent the spread of solitary confinement as a method of criminal justice. Pennsylvania has invested too much political capital and financial resources in Eastern State to abandon the system based on inconvenient evidence. Other states have already begun construction of similar facilities, inspired by Pennsylvania's supposed success in criminal reformation. The machinery of isolation expands across America with industrial efficiency. Auburn Prison in New York adopts a modified version of solitary confinement. Sing Sing follows suit. Within a decade, hundreds of thousands of American prisoners will experience the psychological torture that Eastern State pioneered, each one a test subject, in an experiment that has already proven its fundamental cruelty. By 1833, Eastern State houses 436 prisoners in perfect isolation. Each man exists in his own private hell, sustained by delusions that grow more elaborate with each passing month. The guards move through corridors filled with the muffled sounds of madness, weeping, muttering, occasional screams that pierce the carefully maintained silence like knife blades cutting through fabric. Warden Wood maintains his detailed records, documenting the progression of mental illness with scientific precision. Prisoner 215 believes he's transforming into a bird and spends his days flapping his arms in preparation for flight. Prisoner 308 has convinced himself that his cell is actually a ship sailing across an ocean of divine mercy. Prisoner 402 speaks only in mathematical equations, having lost the ability to communicate in ordinary language. These aren't isolated cases of individual madness. They represent the systematic production of mental illness through architectural design and administrative policy. Eastern State Penitentiary has become a factory for the manufacture of insanity, processing human minds with the same efficiency that textile mills process cotton or steel mills process iron ore. The cost of this efficiency extends far beyond the walls of the prison. Philadelphia's charitable institutions strain under the burden of caring for former Eastern State prisoners whose minds have been shattered by isolation. The Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane adds a special wing devoted entirely to victims of solitary confinement, men whose symptoms differ markedly from conventional mental illness. Dr. Kirkbride's detailed studies of these patients reveal the specific neurological damage caused by prolonged isolation. They suffer from what he terms isolation syndrome, a constellation of symptoms including auditory and visual hallucinations, severe social anxiety, inability to maintain attention during conversations, and a persistent preference for solitude over human companionship. Most troubling of all, these symptoms appear to be permanent. Even years after release, former prisoners show little improvement in their ability to function socially. The human cost of the Pennsylvania system extends beyond the prisoners themselves to their families, who receive no preparation for the broken men returning to their homes. Wives find themselves married to strangers who speak to invisible companions and retreat from human contact. Children discover fathers who no longer recognize them or show any capacity for normal parental affection. Communities struggle to integrate individuals who can no longer function as productive members of society. Yet the experiment continues, driven by institutional momentum and ideological commitment. The Pennsylvania system has acquired the force of religious doctrine, immune to evidence, and resistant to reform. Each new prisoner who enters Eastern State represents another human sacrifice to the altar of enlightened penology, another test subject in an experiment that has already demonstrated its fundamental inhumanity. The silence that defines Eastern State Penitentiary isn't empty. It's filled with the whispered prayers of men going insane, the scratching of fingernails against stone, the wet sound of tears falling onto rough wooden floors. It's the sound of human beings being systematically stripped of everything that makes them human, reduced to isolated fragments of consciousness, trapped in boxes of stone and iron. The machine grinds on, adding new prisoners each month, filling empty cells with fresh subjects for the great American experiment in psychological torture. And in the perfect quietude of those stone corridors, something fundamental about justice and mercy dies a little more each day, replaced by the mechanical efficiency of systematic human destruction.